Hey dreamers, tonight we journey into one of humanity's oldest myths. A tale so ancient, it predates the very idea of civilization. But here's the real question. What drives a goddess to challenge the natural order itself? What makes someone believe they can conquer the realm no living being has ever returned from? And what happens when power meets a place where power means nothing? Picture this, a goddess so fearless, so certain of her own dominion, that she attempts not to escape death, but to overthrow it. Not a rescue mission, a hostile takeover. This is the story of Inanna. And it begins not with humility, but with an appetite for power that will reshape the boundary between worlds. Before we get cozy, if these ancient journeys help you unwind, tap that like button, it really supports the channel. And if you'd like to join our growing family of calm seekers, hit subscribe so you never miss a new story. And tell me in the comments, which ancient myth has always fascinated you the most? I love discovering your favorites. Let us first understand what it meant to be Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, before she ever set foot upon the road to darkness. Imagine, if you will, a realm suspended between Earth and cosmos, a space where divine power flows like rivers of light. Here, in the highest reaches of the sky, there existed a goddess whose authority seemed to touch everything. Inanna. Her name itself was a doorway into her nature. Lady of Heaven. The Sumerians whispered it with reverence. The Akkadians would later know her as Ishtar, and all across Mesopotamia, from the marshes of the south to the great cities of the north, her presence was felt like the pulse of existence itself. She was, by every measure, magnificent. Inanna commanded domains that would have been deemed impossible to reconcile in a mortal mind. She was the goddess of love, the tender, intoxicating kind that made hearts race and cities tremble. But she was also, with equal ferocity, the goddess of war. Where love created bonds, war severed them. Yet Inanna embodied both without contradiction, as if she understood something fundamental about the human condition that lesser beings could not grasp. She moved between these worlds like someone walking through different rooms in an infinite palace. Beyond love and war, Inanna held dominion over fertility, over the cycles of growth and abundance. She was there in every harvest, blessing the land with prosperity or, when angered, cursing it with drought. The farmers who depended on her mercy offered prayers before planting. She was also the keeper of political power, the force that made kings just and empires endure. Warriors called upon her before battle, not simply for victory, but for the judgment to use victory wisely. Her symbol was the 8-pointed star Venus, the brightest point of light in the night sky. Sometimes she appeared as the morning star, heralding the dawn. Other times, she glowed as the evening star, bidding farewell to the day. This duality was fitting for a goddess so full of contradictions. She could bring life or death, love or war, creation or ruin. And unlike many other deities who were bound to a single domain or a single understanding of themselves, Inanna seemed to thrive in the spaces between categories. She was neither purely nurturing nor purely destructive, neither predictable nor capricious. She simply was in all her complexity. In her temples, particularly in the great city of Uruk, where her most magnificent sanctuary stood, there was an atmosphere of divine intoxication. The air itself seemed charged with her presence. Her priests and priestesses moved through those holy spaces with a kind of reverence mixed with electricity. She was not a goddess you prayed to quietly in the corner, hoping not to draw attention. She was a goddess you actively sought out, because her attention, once granted, could transform your life in ways both profound and entirely unpredictable. And here is where we must pause to observe something with quiet humor. Inanna's followers included a class of priests and priestesses that defied simple categorization. Some were male, some female, and many existed in states of being that transcended both categories entirely. They were created, transformed, or chosen. The exact mechanisms were less important than the result. In a world obsessed with order and category, Inanna seemed to delight in the fluid, the undefined, the impossible to pin down. Her clergy, in their own way, reflected her essential nature, a reminder that even the ancient world understood something modern civilization sometimes forgets, that divinity doesn't fit neatly into boxes. Her temples were not places of austere contemplation. They were alive with activity. Incense rose in offerings, music echoed through stone chambers, and visitors came seeking her favor or her blessing. In the courtyards of Uruk, the priestesses of Inanna moved like dancers, and it was said that a moment in their presence could grant a glimpse of the divine. Some of this was metaphorical, of course, but some of it was also entirely practical. These were centers of not just spiritual but also political and economic power. To control the Temple of Inanna was to control significant influence over the city itself. Yet despite all of this, despite her reach into every domain of divine authority, despite her temples and followers and the way her name was invoked by everyone from kings to lovers to desperate farmers, there was one realm that remained beyond her grasp. One kingdom over which her power held no sway. And that realm, as you might guess, was the Underworld. This is the moment, then, where we begin to understand Inanna's ambition and why what she was about to do would shake the very foundations of divine order. The Underworld was ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. And here we arrive at a detail that deserves some contemplation, because it speaks volumes about the nature of divine relationships. These were not sisters who had grown up together, sharing secrets and playing in gardens. Ereshkigal had been taken to the Underworld in an ancient time, pulled down into darkness, and forced to become its queen. She was, in a sense, exiled. While Inanna rose higher and higher into the light, commanding the heavens and the hearts of mortals below, Ereshkigal descended further and further into shadow, into cold, into a kingdom populated solely by the dead. If you had to choose between two sisters, one radiantly powerful in the world above and one isolated in eternal darkness, you might be forgiven for asking, which one had gotten the better bargain? For me, it has to be that Inanna's situation seemed infinitely preferable. The thought of being locked away in a silent, airless realm for eternity with no hope of return, no visitors except those who are dead, and the weight of all death pressing down upon you. That's the kind of loneliness that breaks even divine spirits. Ereshkigal had been forced to endure exactly that, which made her both pitiable and terrifying. The kingdom Ereshkigal ruled was called by many names. Irkalla, Kurnugia, the land of no return. In the Sumerian understanding, it was a place beneath the earth itself, a realm of dust and shadow where the dead gathered in a kind of grey existence. They did not suffer torment, precisely, but neither did they experience joy. They ate clay. They drank murky water. They existed in darkness, separated from all light and warmth and connection to the world they had once inhabited. To enter the underworld as a visitor, let alone to try to reshape its authority, was a violation of cosmic law so profound that it had never been seriously attempted. Yet Inanna, in her chambers high above, surrounded by the trappings of her power. Why? This is the question that has puzzled scholars and storytellers for thousands of years. The cuneiform texts do not explain her motivation with complete clarity. Some later interpreters suggested she wished to steal the sacred me, the divine decrees and principles of civilization, from her sister's realm, just as she had once done with Enki. Others proposed she was attending a funeral for her sister's deceased husband. But what seems most consistent across the old stories is something simpler and far more human. Despite Inanna's divinity, she could not bear the thought of a realm beyond her control. She was the queen of heaven. She commanded love and war. And yet, there existed this one place, this one dark, silent kingdom where her authority meant nothing, where her symbols of power would be stripped away, where she would have no dominion, and Inanna, it seems, could not tolerate that. So she made a decision. Not a rash one, despite what some might think. Inanna was many things, but she was not foolish. She was impulsive, yes. Arrogant, certainly. But there was also in her a kind of shrewd calculation, a deity who understood that you do not simply waltz into the underworld without some preparation. She would descend. She would confront her sister. She would reshape the order of the underworld to suit her ambitions. And she would return, victorious and transformed, or so she believed. In preparation for this unprecedented journey, Inanna began to gather around her the symbols of her power. Each one of these objects was far more than mere decoration. In the Sumerian understanding, these items were the physical manifestations of the me. She possessed the divine forces, the sacred principles, the cosmic authorities that made her who she was. First, there was the Shugura, the crown of heaven itself. When Inanna placed this crown upon her head, she was not simply adorning herself with jewelry. She was donning sovereignty itself, in physical form. The Shugura was said to be fashioned from precious materials, catching the light in ways that seemed almost supernatural. To wear it was to declare to all who beheld you, "I am a ruler. I am touched by the divine. I possess authority that descends from the highest reaches of cosmic order." The crown sat upon her brow like a challenge to the universe itself. Next came the lapis lazuli necklace. This stone, deep blue as the night sky, speckled with gold like distant stars, was perhaps the most significant symbol of all. The Sumerians believed that lapis lazuli was not merely beautiful. It was a conduit for divine power. To wear it was to carry within yourself a piece of the heavens themselves. The stone was said to house the very soul of the divine, and through it, one could access powers beyond normal comprehension. When Inanna wrapped the lapis lazuli beads around her neck, she was not simply putting on an accessory. She was encircling herself with cosmic authority. Her fingers received golden rings, not one, but multiple. Gold was the metal of the gods, precious beyond measure, and it gleamed with a kind of eternal light. Each ring was a declaration of divine status, a physical marking of her connection to the sacred. Around her breast she fastened the breastplate called "Come, Man, Come." The name itself was almost mockingly sensual, and there was in it a kind of command. This was not armor designed to protect her from physical harm in any conventional sense. It was a garment of spiritual and charismatic power, one that embodied her dominion over attraction, over desire, over the kind of power that comes from being utterly compelling. She adorned her eyes with ointment, a substance called "Let him come again," a name that spoke to her power of attraction and command. With the proper cosmetics applied, her gaze itself became a weapon, a tool of persuasion and will. In her hand, she gripped the lapis lazuli measuring rod and line instruments of order, of justice, of divine measurement. These were the tools by which cosmic balance was maintained, by which the proper proportions of the universe were preserved. They symbolized her role not just as a goddess of passion and chaos, but as a keeper of order and cosmic law. Over her body she draped the pala dress, the garment of ladyship. They called it a robe that announced her status and authority to any who beheld her. It flowed around her like liquid majesty, and finally, there was her face itself, the dark locks of hair arranged carefully across her brow, each strand placed precisely. In Mesopotamian culture, the way one presented one's physical form was itself a language of power and intention. Inanna arranged herself as a work of divine art, a goddess, literally dressed in her own authority. To understand what happened next, you must understand what these objects represented. They were not mere symbols. In the Sumerian understanding of divinity, the boundary between symbol and reality was far more fluid than modern minds might imagine. When Inanna wore these items, she was not pretending to have power. She was wearing power itself, made manifest in physical form. Each garment was a divine decree, a cosmic principle. Together, they formed a kind of armor of authority so complete that it would be difficult to overstate its significance. To strip Inanna of these objects would be to strip her of her very essence. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, there was something else Inanna needed to do. She needed to make arrangements. She called to her side her most trusted and faithful servant, Ninshubur. Ninshubur was not merely a servant in the way that word is sometimes understood. She was, in fact, something far more. A sukal, they called her. A divine attendant, a messenger, an advisor, and a warrior, all at once. There were tales of how she had defended the boat of heaven itself, beating back monsters and the fury of other gods to ensure Inanna's safety. She was the voice Inanna trusted absolutely, the presence at her side that meant something had been given serious thought. In some texts, Ninshubur is described as male, in others, female, and in still others, the gender seems almost irrelevant to the point being made. What mattered was that Ninshuba was loyal not out of obligation or compulsion, but out of a love so deep and so genuine that it transcended normal categories of relationship. Ninshuba would have followed Inanna to the ends of creation itself. And so, as Inanna made her preparations, she turned to this faithful companion and spoke words that would echo through mythology. Ninshuba, my constant support, my sukkel who gives me wise advice, my warrior who fights by my side. Hear me now, for I descend to the Kur, to the Underworld. I am going to that place from which no traveller returns. I am going to challenge my sister, to reshape her realm, to extend my dominion into darkness itself. And then Inanna spoke the contingency that no one in heaven had imagined might actually be necessary. The contingency that showed, despite her arrogance and ambition, some particle of wisdom. But if I do not return, if this audacity proves too great even for me, then you will know what to do. What followed was a series of instructions so specific, so detailed, that they spoke to the seriousness with which Inanna approached her own potential failure. She knew, on some level, that what she was attempting had never been done. "If I do not return," Inanna said, "you will set up a lament for me by the ruins of the city. You will beat the drum for me in the assembly places where people gather. You will circle the houses of the gods. You will not rest. You will not accept comfort. You will tear at your eyes, at your mouth, at your thighs. You will dress yourself in a single garment like a beggar, and you will make your grief known to every corner of the world." The purpose of these instructions was not simply to ensure that Inanna was mourned, it was something far more strategic. In Sumerian belief, such actions were not merely emotional expressions. They were magical in their own right. The wailing, the beating of drums, the visible signs of grief, these were forms of power themselves, ways of moving the cosmos, ways of compelling divine attention. "And," Inanna continued, "you will go to the temples of the great gods. You will go first to Enlil, father of all things. You will go to Nanna, god of the moon and protector of my blood. You will go to Anu, the supreme sky father. And finally, and listen carefully to this, you will go to Enki, god of wisdom and waters. You will plead with them all. You will beg them, on behalf of one they have favored, to rescue me from the darkness." Here was something interesting, a kind of cosmic insurance policy. Inanna was not relying entirely on Ninshuba's devotion, though that was crucial. She was activating in advance a network of divine obligation. By giving Ninshuba instructions to appeal to the great gods, she was banking on the notion that even the most powerful deities would be compelled to act when the situation was properly framed by ritual and entreaty. It was clever, in the way that many of Inanna's schemes were clever. She was, essentially, setting up a fail-safe, a series of mechanisms that would automatically deploy should her descent go catastrophically wrong. Ninshuba listened to all of this in silence. We can only imagine what thoughts ran through the mind of this loyal companion. Here was her beloved queen, radiant and powerful, essentially describing contingency plans for her own death. There was something both admirable and deeply troubling about the conversation. When the instructions were complete, Inanna spoke once more, and in this final moment there was perhaps a glimpse of something like affection beneath the divine majesty. "Ninshuba, you are my constant support, my sukkel who gives me wise advice, my warrior who fights by my side. I am descending to the underworld and I am not certain I will return. If I do not do all of this, be faithful, be fierce, be my voice in the world above. That is all I ask." And with that, Inanna prepared to take her first step toward darkness. But before we follow her into that journey, before we accompany her to the gates of the underworld, we must pause and contemplate something about what we have just witnessed. Here was a goddess so convinced of her own authority that she believed she could do what had never been done. She believed she could descend into a realm from which none return, and return anyway. She believed she could shake the very foundations of cosmic order. And perhaps most tellingly, here was someone so accustomed to her own power that she prepared for failure by ensuring someone else would take action on her behalf. Not because she doubted her own strength, but because she understood, on some level, that even gods are subject to certain laws. The irony, of course, was that those laws were about to teach Inanna a lesson more profound than any she had yet learned. The underworld awaits. The gates await. And the greatest challenge Inanna would ever face, not to her power, but to her very understanding of what power means, was about to begin. So we arrive then at the moment of true beginning, not the decision to descend. That was merely thought given shape. Not the preparation with her divine regalia, that was theatre, however magnificent. No, the true beginning comes when Inanna stands before the first gate of the underworld and realizes, perhaps for the first time in her eternal existence, that she is about to enter a space where the rules are not hers to write. Agi, the journey to reach the gates themselves, was uneventful, which should have been her first warning. In the world above, Inanna's movements created ripples of consequence. When she walked through Uruk, people stopped and stared. When she crossed the boundaries between cities, the very air seemed to shimmer with awareness of her passage. But as she descended down through layers of earth, through passages that grew progressively darker and colder, there was only silence. No fanfare, no recognition. Just the slow, inexorable pull of gravity and the growing certainty that she was moving toward something that had been waiting for her since before time had a name. The underworld did not announce itself with drama. There were no rivers of fire, no wailing souls visible from a distance, no spectacular architecture designed to inspire terror. Instead, what Inanna encountered as she approached the realm of Kur was something far more unsettling: absence. An absence of light, yes, but also an absence of movement, of sound, of the vital energy that characterized every other space she had ever inhabited. The air itself, if it could still be called air, felt thick and stale, as if it had been breathed and rebreathed by countless dead mouths until all the vitality had been extracted from it. Dust. That was what she noticed most acutely. Dust seemed to hang in the atmosphere like a permanent fog, settling on every surface, coating everything in a uniform grey pallor. It was the dust of dissolution, of things broken down to their smallest particles and then left to simply exist in that state forever. Nothing grew here. Nothing changed. The dust simply accumulated, layer upon layer, age upon age, until the very concept of renewal seemed like a distant myth told in another language. And the silence. Oh, the silence was its own kind of violence. Inanna, who had spent eternity surrounded by prayer and music and the clamour of mortal desire, found herself in a place where sound itself seemed reluctant to exist. Her footsteps, which should have echoed, were instead swallowed by the dust. Her breathing, normally such a minor thing she never noticed it, became loud in her own ears precisely because there was nothing else to hear. It was the silence of a tomb sealed for millennia, the silence of a place where even memory goes to fade. The palace of Ganza rose before her like a monument to inevitability. If you could even call it rising, the structure seemed less built than simply present, as if it had always existed and would continue existing long after everything else had crumbled to that omnipresent dust. The walls were dark, constructed from stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There were no windows, no openings except for the gates themselves. 7 of them, she had heard. 7 gates between the outer threshold and the throne room where her sister waited. 7 was not an arbitrary number. The Mesopotamians understood numbers as carriers of cosmic significance, and 7 held particular power. 7 planets visible to the naked eye. 7 days in the week. 7 was completion but also trial. 7 was the number of passage and transformation. That there would be 7 gates spoke to the ritual nature of what she was about to experience. This was not simply passage through space. This was passage through meaning itself. Inanna stood before the first gate and, for just a moment, hesitated. It was the briefest flicker of doubt, the smallest whisper of a voice inside her that asked, "What if you simply turned around? What if you went back to the world above, where you were powerful and loved and feared in equal measure? What if you simply let this one realm remain beyond your grasp?" But Inanna was Inanna, and gods do not build themselves on moderation. She raised her hand and pounded on the gate with a force that should have shaken the foundations of the underworld itself. The sound was flat, dull, absorbed by the oppressive atmosphere, but it was heard nevertheless. "Miko, open this gate," she commanded, her voice carrying all the authority of the Queen of Heaven. "I am Inanna, and I demand entry." For a long moment nothing happened. The silence pressed in from all sides. Then, with a sound like stone grinding against bone, the gate opened just enough to reveal a figure standing in the gap. Neti, the chief gatekeeper of the underworld, guardian of thresholds, enforcer of the laws of the dead. He was not what you might expect a demon of the underworld to look like. There was no horrific appearance, no grotesque features designed to inspire terror. Instead, Neti appeared almost bureaucratic in his demeanor, neither cruel nor kind, merely dutiful. He looked at Inanna with eyes that had seen countless souls pass through these gates, and in those eyes was something that might have been pity, or perhaps just the weariness of someone who has performed the same task since the beginning of existence. "Peka, who are you?" Neti asked in a voice as dry as the dust that coated everything, "and why have you come to this place?" Inanna drew herself up to her full divine height, and even here, even in this place of shadow and silence, she was magnificent. The Shugura, the crown of heaven, caught what little light existed and seemed to glow with its own internal radiance. Her lapis lazuli necklace gleamed against her skin. The golden rings on her fingers reflected her power. She was, in that moment, every inch the goddess she had always been. "Polch, I am Inanna, queen of heaven and earth," she declared. "I have come to attend the funeral rites of Gugalanna, the bull of heaven, husband to my sister Ereshkigal. The rites must be properly observed, and I have come to pay my respects." It was, of course, a lie, or perhaps not entirely a lie, but certainly not the complete truth. Gugalanna had indeed died killed by Gilgamesh and Enkidu in one of those grand heroic adventures that mortals seemed so fond of. And there would have been funeral rites. But Inanna's purpose in coming here had nothing to do with mourning and everything to do with conquest. She had come to extend her dominion into the one realm that had remained beyond her grasp. Neti regarded her with those ancient, weary eyes. He had heard every excuse, every justification, every plea from every soul that had ever stood at this gate. He knew a lie when he heard one. But it was not his place to judge the truth or falsehood of her words. His place was simply to report them. "2. Wait here," he said, and closed the gate. The sound of his footsteps faded into the oppressive silence, and Inanna was left alone in the dust and the dark. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours, or perhaps days. Time moved strangely here, or perhaps it did not move at all. She found herself growing impatient, then irritated, then genuinely angry. She, who commanded the love and fear of all creation, was being made to wait like some common petitioner at a mortal king's court. Finally, after what felt like an eternity compressed into a moment, Neti returned. He opened the gate once more, wider this time, enough for her to enter if she chose. "Queen Ereshkigal has heard your request," Neti said, his voice betraying nothing of what had transpired in the throne room beyond. She bids you enter and attend the funeral rites you claim to seek. But you must understand, this is the Underworld. This is the realm of the dead, and here we have laws that even the Queen of Heaven must observe." There was something in the way he said those last words that should have given Inanna pause, a warning perhaps, an invitation to reconsider, but she was already committed. She had announced her intention. She had demanded entry. To turn back now would be to admit limitation, and Inanna had not built her divinity on accepting limits. "Profession, I will observe your laws," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she had no idea what those laws might be. "Now let me pass." Nettie stepped aside, and Inanna moved forward to cross the first threshold. "Your crown," Nettie said suddenly, his hand outstretched. "You must remove it here." Inanna stopped as if she had walked into an invisible wall. "What? Why? This is the Shugura, the crown of heaven itself. I do not simply remove it because some gatekeeper demands it." Be quiet, Inanna," Nettie replied, and his voice now carried the full weight of cosmic law behind it. "The ways of the Underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." For a long moment they stood facing each other, the goddess of heaven and the gatekeeper of the dead, engaged in a silent battle of wills. Inanna's hand moved instinctively to her crown, touching it protectively. The Shugura was not merely decoration. It was sovereignty itself, crystallized into physical form. To remove it was to remove a fundamental part of her identity. But the gate would not open further. Nettie would not move, and the laws of the Underworld, it seemed, were not subject to negotiation. With movements that felt like tearing away part of her own flesh, Inanna lifted the crown of heaven from her head and placed it in Nettie's waiting hand. The moment her fingers released it, she felt something shift inside her. Not pain exactly, but absence, as if a frequency she had been hearing her entire existence had suddenly gone silent. She felt lighter, but not in a pleasant way. She felt diminished. Nettie took the crown without ceremony and set it aside. "You may enter," he said, and pulled the first gate fully open. Inanna passed through, and the gate closed behind her with a finality that echoed in the dust-thick air. The space between the first and second gate was a corridor of sorts, though that word implies architecture more deliberate than what existed here. It was simply a passage, dark, narrow, with walls that seemed to absorb any sound she made. The dust was thicker here, if that were possible, and she found herself having to concentrate on each breath. The air tasted of clay and age and forgotten things. She could feel the absence of her crown with every step. Her head felt exposed, vulnerable. She kept wanting to reach up and adjust it, only to remember it was no longer there. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scheme of cosmic power. But it was also everything. The crown was recognition, was authority, was the visible proof that she stood above others. Without it, she was simply herself. And that, she was beginning to realize, might not be enough. The second gate loomed ahead faster than she expected, as if distance itself obeyed different rules down here. Nettie was already waiting, having somehow travelled from the first gate to the second through some path she could not perceive. "Your necklace," he said, before she could even announce herself. "The lapis lazuli beads. You must remove them here." This time there was no negotiation. Inanna had learned the futility of argument, but that did not make it any easier. The lapis lazuli necklace was perhaps the most precious of all her regalia. The deep blue stone, speckled with gold like the night sky itself, was not merely beautiful. It was a conduit of divine power, a piece of the heavens themselves wrapped around her throat. To wear it was to carry the cosmic order against your very pulse. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached up to unclasp it. The beads were warm from contact with her skin, and they caught what little light existed, glowing softly. She held them for a moment, feeling their weight, their significance. Then she placed them in Netti's hand, and another piece of herself went silent. The second gate opened. She passed through. It closed. Between the second and third gate, the darkness seemed to intensify. Or perhaps her ability to perceive light was diminishing with each item removed. She found herself walking more slowly, her hands occasionally reaching out to touch the walls for guidance. The walls were cold, stone worn smooth by ages of that pervasive dust. She was beginning to understand something about the architecture of this descent. Each gate was not simply a physical barrier, each gate was a threshold of transformation. Each removal was not merely the loss of an object, but the stripping away of a layer of power, of identity, of the divine persona she had constructed over millennia. She was being deconstructed, piece by piece, reduced to something more essential and far more vulnerable. But the third gate, Nettie required the removal of the beads upon her breast, the double strand of precious stones that adorned her chest. She removed them without argument, though each bead felt like a drop of her own divine essence being drained away. At the fourth gate, it was the pectoral, the breastplate called "Come, man, come," that garment of attraction and command that embodied her dominion over desire itself. When she removed it, she felt the loss of a particular kind of power, the power to compel, to draw others to her through sheer charismatic force. It was the power that had made kings grovel and poets sing, and warriors dedicate their victories to her name. Gone now, added to the pile of discarded divinity. A spear. Between each gate, the journey seemed to grow longer, though the physical distance likely remained the same. Or perhaps she was simply moving more slowly, weighed down by the accumulating awareness of her own diminishment. The dust was in her hair now, coating her skin, filling her nostrils with that taste of clay and dissolution. She who had always smelled of oils and perfumes and the intoxicating scent of power now smelled of nothing but this ancient, patient decay. At the fifth gate, Nettie reached for her golden ring, the ring that marked her divine status, that declared her one of the eternal ones, touched by cosmic significance. Gold, the metal of the gods, the substance that never tarnished, never aged, never lost its luster. She twisted it from her finger and watched as it disappeared into Nettie's possession. Her hands looked strange without it, ordinary, almost mortal. She was more than halfway through now, 4 gates behind her, 3 ahead. She could feel Ereshkigal's presence somewhere beyond, waiting with whatever patience the Queen of the Dead possessed. Her sister. The thought was strange. They shared blood, shared divine origin, yet had become beings so fundamentally different that they might as well have been created by separate cosmic forces. Inanna, ascending into light and power and worship. Ereshkigal, descending into shadow and silence and the weight of endless death. What must it be like, Inanna wondered as she approached the 6th gate, to rule a kingdom where nothing ever changes, where there is no growth, no transformation, no surprise. Just the endless accumulation of the dead, one after another, throughout all of time, with no hope of reprieve or renewal. The thought was suffocating. At the 6th gate, Nettie demanded the lapis lazuli measuring rod and line, those instruments of cosmic order, of justice, of divine measurement. These were the tools by which the universe was kept in balance, by which proper proportions were maintained. To surrender them was to surrender her role as a keeper of order, as an enforcer of cosmic law. She placed them in his hands and felt another essential piece of her identity dissolve into the darkness. 2. Only 1 gate remained. The passage between the 6th and 7th gate felt different. The darkness here was absolute, not merely the absence of light, but the presence of something that actively resisted illumination. She moved forward by feel alone, her hands against the cold stone walls, her feet shuffling through the thick dust. She could hear nothing but her own breathing, which had become labored, difficult, not because the air was thin though it was, but because with each removal, with each stripping away of power, she was becoming more aware of her physical form in ways she had never had to consider before. Gods do not typically concern themselves with breathing. But here, now, reduced and diminishing, she was discovering that even divine lungs need air. At the seventh gate, Neti stood waiting as he had at all the others, but this time his expression, if such ancient, dutiful features could be said to have expressions, held something that might have been sympathy. "Hurus," he said quietly, "the pala, the garment of ladyship, you must remove it here." This was the final threshold. Inanna looked down at the robe that flowed around her body like liquid majesty, the garment that announced her status and authority to any who beheld her. Without it, she would be naked. Without it, she would be stripped not just of power, but of dignity, of the visual language through which divinity communicated its nature to the world. "Double why?" she asked, and her voice was smaller than it had been at the first gate. Not because she expected an answer. She had learned by now that why was not a question the Underworld acknowledged, but because she needed to voice her resistance one final time. "Be quiet, Inanna," Neti replied as he had replied at every gate. "The ways of the Underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." She unfastened the pala with hands that felt clumsy, almost mortal. The fabric slipped from her shoulders, pulled at her feet, and was handed over to Neti, and with it went the last visible marker of who she had been. She stood naked before the seventh gate, stripped of every symbol of power, every declaration of authority, every physical manifestation of her divine nature. She was, in that moment, simply a soul, vulnerable, exposed, reduced to the most essential version of herself that had ever existed. The seventh gate opened. Beyond it she could see light, not the warm, golden light of the sun or the gentle silver of the moon, but a cold, blue-green light that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the throne room itself. The walls were indeed constructed of lapis lazuli, as the old stories claimed, and that precious stone glowed with its own internal radiance, casting everything in an underwater luminescence that was more unsettling than beautiful. Inanna took her first step forward, naked as the day she first came into existence, and crossed the final threshold. She had descended through 7 gates, she had been stripped of 7 sacred items, she had passed through 7 stages of reduction and dissolution. The journey that had begun with such arrogance, such certainty of her own power and her rightful dominion over all realms, had transformed into something else entirely. A lesson in humility administered 1 gate at a time, 1 removal at a time, 1 loss at a time. The throne room of the Underworld was vast and terrible in its simplicity. The lapis lazuli walls enclosed a space that seemed to swallow sound and light in equal measure. There were no decorations, no tapestries, no signs of warmth or life. Just the stone, the dust, the silence, and at the far end, upon a throne carved from the same dark stone that formed the palace walls, sat Ereshkigal. And around that throne, standing like sentinels of judgment, were the 7 Anunnaki, the judges of the dead, those ancient and terrible beings whose task was to determine the fate of every soul that entered this realm. He turned as one to look at Inanna as she entered, and in their eyes she saw something she had never encountered before, complete and utter indifference. Not anger, not fear, not even curiosity. Just the cool, dispassionate gaze of beings who had witnessed countless souls arrive in exactly this state, naked, powerless, reduced to their essential selves, and found nothing remarkable about it whatsoever. Ereshkigal rose from her throne, and Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love and war, keeper of the sacred me, commander of the sky and earth, stood before her sister with nothing, no crown to proclaim her sovereignty, no jewels to display her wealth, no garments to announce her status, no tools to enforce her will. She had been systematically deconstructed by the journey through the 7 gates, and what remained was simply this: a naked soul standing in the realm of death, facing the judgment of beings who could not be charmed, could not be seduced, could not be intimidated, and could not be impressed. The descent was complete. What she had failed to understand in all her planning and preparation was that the underworld did not need to fight her. It did not need to meet her power with equal power. It simply needed to wait, patient and inevitable as time itself, and let her own ambition carry her through those 7 gates. Each gate she chose to pass through, each item she chose to surrender, each step deeper into darkness she chose to take. The underworld had not conquered her. She had conquered herself, or rather, revealed the truth that beneath all her accumulated power and authority, she was fundamentally the same as any other soul that entered this realm. In the world above, Inanna had been magnificent, but here in the court of Ereshkigal, surrounded by the judges of the dead and the weight of infinite mortality, she was simply one more naked soul awaiting judgment. And the terrible realization that was beginning to dawn in her divine consciousness was this: perhaps that had been the point all along. The silence in the throne room was not empty. It was full of weight, full of presence, full of the accumulated density of every death that had ever occurred since the beginning of time. Inanna stood in that silence, naked and diminished, and for the first time in her eternal existence, she understood what it meant to be truly seen without the armor of divinity protecting her from scrutiny. Ereshkigal had risen from her throne, and the movement itself seemed to disturb the air in ways that ordinary motion should not. She was taller than Inanna remembered, or perhaps the throne room simply made everything seem larger, more monumental, more final. Her sister's face was pale, not with the luminous pallor of moonlight or the alabaster beauty of divine complexion, but with the exhausted whiteness of someone who has not seen the sun in millennia. Her eyes, when they fixed on Inanna, held no warmth whatsoever. Okay, but neither did they hold simple hatred. And this, perhaps, was what made the moment so much more terrible than Inanna had anticipated. Ereshkigal looked at her naked, stripped sister with an expression that contained layer upon layer of emotion, each one more complex and painful than the last. There was anger, yes, a deep ancient rage that had been accumulating for ages. But beneath that anger was something else: grief, profound, oceanic grief. The kind of sorrow that comes from being forced into a role you never chose, in a realm you never wanted, for an eternity that stretches ahead with no possibility of change or escape. "Oh, so," Ereshkigal said, and her voice was like stone grinding against stone, dry and rough and utterly devoid of anything that might be called mercy. "The Queen of Heaven has descended. The goddess who commands love and war, who holds the hearts of mortals in her hands, who moves through the world above like light itself. She has come to my kingdom." Inanna opened her mouth to respond, to say something that might salvage this situation. But Ereshkigal raised a hand, and the gesture was so absolute, so commanding, that even stripped of all her power, Inanna found herself unable to speak. "Do not," Ereshkigal continued, taking a step down from her throne, "presume to offer me your excuses. Do not speak to me of funeral rites for Gugalanna, as if I did not know that you cared nothing for him while he lived, and care less for him now that he is dead. Do not insult me with the lies you told Nettie at my gates." Each word was precise, calculated, and they fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that seemed to extend throughout the entire throne room. The 7 Anunnaki, who had been standing silent as sentinels around Ereshkigal's throne, shifted slightly, as if responding to the emotional frequency in their queen's voice. These 7 judges, these ancient arbiters of death, were not what Inanna had expected. She had imagined demons, perhaps, or monsters with grotesque features and terrible visages designed to inspire fear. But the Anunnaki were something far more disturbing in their ordinariness. They appeared almost like divine bureaucrats, beings who had performed the same function for so long that they had become the function itself. Their faces were impassive, their eyes cold but not cruel, simply observant. Among them stood Nergal, god of plague and war, who served as one of the enforcers within this realm. Beside him was Namta, Ereshkigal's vizier, the one who delivered decrees of fate with the mechanical precision of someone who has done so 1,000,000 times and will do so 1,000,000 times more. There was Husbishag, keeper of the tools and order of the realm, and Ningishida, a warrior god tied to death and regeneration. Ninazimwa, the divine scribe goddess, stood with what might have been tablets or records, the keeper of the Underworld's accounts, and there were others whose names had been lost to time, but whose presence was no less significant. Together they formed a council of absolute authority. They were the judges of every soul that entered this realm, and their verdicts were final. No appeal, no reconsideration, no mercy. "You came here," Ereshkigal continued, descending another step, and with each step she took toward her naked sister, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, because you could not tolerate a realm beyond your control. "Because you, Inanna, Queen of Heaven, Goddess of Love and War, could not accept that there exists in this universe one place where your beauty means nothing, where your power holds no sway, where your name inspires no reverence." And here, something cracked in Ereshkigal's voice. Not weakness, nothing so simple as weakness. It was something deeper, something rawer. It was the sound of a wound that had never healed, had never even begun to heal, because the conditions for healing had never existed. "While you danced in the sunlight," she said, and now there was a tremor beneath the stone of her voice, "I dwelt in darkness. While you received offerings of honey and wine and the prayers of lovers, I received only corpses. While you accumulated power and worshippers and the adoration of mortals and gods alike, I sat on this throne in this silent palace, surrounded by the dead, with no hope of reprieve, no possibility of change, no chance to ever again feel sunlight on my skin." Inanna, standing naked before her sister, felt something she had never experienced before, not fear, though there was certainly fear present, but shame. Deep, burning shame. Because everything Ereshkigal was saying was true. She had come here out of ambition, out of a refusal to accept limitation, out of that same arrogant certainty that had characterized her entire existence. And she had never once considered what it might be like for Ereshkigal, trapped here alone, ruling over silence and dust and the endless accumulation of death. "I was taken," Ereshkigal said, and now she was standing directly before Inanna, so close that they could have touched. "I was pulled down into this darkness and forced to become its queen. I did not choose this. I did not want this. And while I learned to endure it, learned to bear the weight of all death pressing down upon me, learned to find what small dignity I could in this role, you remained above, radiant and free, collecting powers and domains as if they were trinkets to adorn yourself with." The 7 Anunnaki watched this exchange with their cold, impassive eyes. They had seen this before, not this exact scenario, perhaps, but variations on the theme. The confrontation between the living and the dead, between power and powerlessness, between the world above and the world below. They were not moved by drama. They simply observed and waited. And now, Ereshkigal said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrible than a shout, "You have come here, to my realm, uninvited, unwelcome, with your lies about funeral rites and your certainty that you could somehow reshape the laws of death itself to suit your purposes." She stepped back, and in that stepping back, something shifted in the atmosphere of the throne room. The anger that had been personal, intimate, almost painful in its vulnerability, suddenly crystallized into something else, something colder, something absolute. "You have violated the sanctity of the Underworld," Ereshkigal declared, and now her voice carried the full weight of cosmic law. "You have crossed the boundaries that separate the living from the dead. You have descended through the 7 gates, and with each gate you agreed to the laws of this realm. And now those laws will be applied to you." She turned to the 7 Anunnaki and spoke words that echoed through the lapis lazuli chambers. "Judges of the Underworld, arbiters of fate, keepers of the final threshold, look upon this one who has descended, pass your judgment." The 7 judges moved as one. It was not a dramatic movement. There were no grand gestures, no theatrical pronouncements. They simply shifted their collective attention from passive observation to active judgment. And in that shift, Inanna felt something that made every loss at the 7 gates seem trivial by comparison. Their eyes, all 7 pairs of eyes, turned upon her simultaneously. Nay, this was the eye of death spoken of in whispers above, the gaze that could unmake a soul, the look that carried within it the weight of absolute finality. It was not metaphorical, it was utterly, terribly literal. When the 7 Anunnaki looked at you with judgment in their eyes, they saw not what you were, but what you would become. They saw through the illusion of permanence that even gods clung to. They saw the essential truth that everything eventually returns to dust. Inanna felt that gaze like a physical force. It was not painful exactly, though pain might have been easier to endure. It was erasure. Each moment under their collective scrutiny felt like a layer of her being was being peeled away, examined, and found wanting. They saw her arrogance. They saw her ambition. They saw the emptiness beneath all her accumulated power, the truth that she had built herself out of roles and domains and worship because, stripped of those things, she was terrified of what might remain. The judges did not speak. They had no need for words. Their judgment was communicated through that terrible, silent gaze. And then, one by one, they turned their eyes away, back to their positions of eternal watching. The judgment had been passed. The verdict was delivered. And in that turning away, in that withdrawal of attention, Inanna understood what had been decided. "Are guilty?" Ereshkigal stepped forward again, and now there was no anger in her expression, no grief, no personal emotion at all. She had transformed from a bitter, wounded sister into something else entirely, the embodiment of the Underworld's laws, the personification of death's absolute authority. "Inanna," she said, and the name sounded like a judgment in itself, Queen of Heaven, Goddess of Love and War. "You have been found guilty of transgression against the sacred laws of the Underworld. You have descended without permission. You have come with deceit in your heart. You have challenged the order of death itself." She raised her hand, and in that gesture was contained all the power of the realm she ruled. Not the chaotic creative power of the world above, but the cold final power of endings. The power that says, "This far and no further." "I fix upon you," Ereshkigal intoned, her eyes meeting Inanna's for one final moment, the eye of death. And she looked at Inanna. not with the collective gaze of the Anunnaki, but with her own eyes. Eyes that had witnessed endless ages of death, eyes that had seen every form of dissolution, eyes that knew intimately the process by which life transforms into clay and dust. Under that gaze, Inanna felt her divine essence begin to unravel. It started slowly, a coldness spreading from where Ereshkigal's eyes met hers, moving through her like frost forming on a window. The divine spark that had animated her since before memory, that had allowed her to command love and inspire war, that had given her dominion over the hearts of mortals and the respect of gods. It began to dim. I speak upon you, Ereshkigal continued, her voice resonating with the fundamental frequencies of dissolution, the word of wrath. And she spoke it. The actual word is not recorded in any text that survives, and perhaps that is mercy of a sort, because words of that nature, words that carry the full weight of cosmic law, words that can unmake a goddess, are not meant for mortal ears or even divine repetition. It was a word that meant ending. It was a word that meant completion. It was a word that meant the transformation of something living into something dead. The effect was immediate and total. Inanna's divine essence, already dimming under Ereshkigal's gaze, simply stopped. Like a flame suddenly deprived of air, like a river abruptly dammed, like a song cut off mid-note. The goddess who had stood radiant in the throne room, naked, yes, and stripped of her power, yes, but still fundamentally divine, still essentially alive, became something else in an instant. A corpse. A corpse. Not metaphorically dead, not symbolically deceased. Actually, literally, completely dead. The transformation was so absolute that her body, which had been standing upright, began to fall. She did not collapse dramatically or cry out in shock or make any sound at all. She simply became a weight subject to gravity, and gravity pulled her down into the dust that coated the floor. 2. The throne room was silent, even more silent than before if such a thing were possible, because now the silence was absolute. There was no breath, no heartbeat, no divine presence emanating from the figure that had been Inanna, just a corpse lying in the dust. Ereshkigal looked down at her sister's body with an expression that might have been satisfaction, or might have been sorrow, or might have been the exhausted acknowledgement of a duty fulfilled. It was impossible to tell. She had done what the laws of the underworld required. She had judged the transgressor. She had enacted the punishment. And now, standing over her sister's corpse in her lapis lazuli throne room, surrounded by the 7 Anunnaki and the weight of endless death, she looked less like a victorious ruler and more like someone who has lost something irretrievable. Don Namtar, she said to her vizier, her voice flat and emotionless. Chi. The death god stepped forward, awaiting instruction. Take the corpse, Ereshkigal commanded, and hang it on a hook on the wall. Let it remain there as a reminder to any who might consider violating the laws of this realm. Let it be seen by every soul that enters. Let it speak without words of what happens when even the Queen of Heaven presumes to challenge the authority of death. Namtar moved with the efficiency of someone who has performed similar tasks countless times. He lifted Inanna's corpse, and it was strange how light it seemed now, how reduced, how utterly lacking in the presence that had once made her so magnificent. He carried it to the wall of the throne room, where a hook protruded from the lapis lazuli stone. The hook was not decorative, it was functional, designed for exactly this purpose. There had been others before Inanna, though their names were forgotten, their crimes lost to the dust of ages. Namtar hung the corpse on the hook, and it settled there with a terrible finality. the body of the Queen of Heaven, naked and lifeless, suspended from the wall like a piece of meat left to cure or rot. The arms hung limply, the head lolled forward, the eyes, those eyes that had once commanded worship and inspired desire, were empty, staring at nothing. This was the climax of the descent. This was the end point of the journey that had begun with such arrogance and certainty. Inanna, who had believed she could extend her dominion into the underworld, who had thought her power sufficient to reshape even the laws of death, who had descended through 7 gates with the absolute conviction that she would return victorious, she had been utterly, completely, devastatingly defeated. Tefev and Anunnaki returned to their positions around the throne, silent observers once more, their duty fulfilled. Ereshkigal ascended back to her seat, settling into it with the weariness of someone who has completed an exhausting but necessary task. And the throne room returned to its eternal state, silent, dark, dusty, populated only by the dead and those who ruled over them. Above, in the world of light and life, no one yet knew what had happened. The temples of Inanna still received their offerings. The priestesses still moved through their rituals. The lovers still invoked her name. The warriors still sought her blessing before battle. Life continued as it always had, unaware that the goddess they worshipped had been reduced to a corpse hanging on a hook in the realm of death. But Ninshuba knew. Or rather, Ninshuba would know soon. 3 days, Inanna had said. If she did not return in 3 days, Ninshuba was to begin the morning rituals, to approach the great gods, to plead for rescue. The faithful Sukal waited above, counting time, watching for any sign of her beloved queen's return. In the underworld, time moved differently. Or perhaps it did not move at all. But in the world above, those 3 days would pass with the inexorable certainty of a river flowing toward the sea. And when they had passed, when it became clear that Inanna would not return on her own, then, and only then, would the next phase of this ancient story begin. But that was not yet. For now, there was only this: a corpse on a hook, a queen on a throne, 7 judges standing in silent witness, and a palace of lapis lazuli glowing with that cold blue-green light that illuminated nothing but the truth of what happens when even the gods overstep their boundaries. The defeat was total. The humiliation was complete. The Queen of Heaven had challenged the realm of death and learned, in the most brutal way possible, that some laws are not subject to negotiation. Some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, and some powers exist precisely to remind even the mighty that they too are subject to forces greater than themselves. Jask. And so Inanna hung there, dead and diminishing, slowly becoming nothing more than another piece of the underworld's long, silent history. A cautionary tale, a reminder, a corpse. 3 days passed in the world above. 3 nights descended and lifted again, the cycle continuing as it always had, indifferent to the dramas playing out in the realms below. In the temples of Uruk, the priestesses continued their rituals, unaware that the goddess they served had been reduced to a corpse hanging on a hook in the palace of the dead. The morning star still rose, though its light now seemed somehow dimmer, as if the cosmos itself sensed something fundamental had shifted. Lovers still whispered Inanna's name in moments of passion. Warriors still invoked her before battle. Life continued with the stubborn persistence that characterizes all living things, even when the divine order that supposedly governs them has been fundamentally disrupted. But Ninshuba knew. Or rather, Ninshuba counted time with the meticulous attention of someone who understands that everything depends on her vigilance. 3 days, Inanna had said. If she did not return in 3 days, then the contingency plan would activate. And Ninshuba faithful beyond measure, loyal beyond reason, had waited those 3 days with a growing certainty in her heart that the Queen of Heaven was not coming back on her own. On the morning of the 4th day, when the sun rose and Inanna still had not emerged from whatever darkness she had descended into, Ninshubur began the rituals her mistress had prescribed. She went first to the ruins at the edge of the city, those ancient, crumbling structures that spoke of civilizations that had risen and fallen long before even the gods had walked the earth in their current forms. There, among the broken stones and the dust of forgotten peoples, she set up a lament. The sound that came from Ninshuba was not merely crying, it was something far more primal, far more deliberate. It was grief weaponized, sorrow transformed into a tool of cosmic manipulation. She beat the drum with rhythms that echoed the heartbeat of the universe itself, irregular, desperate, demanding attention. The sound carried across the city, and those who heard it felt something shift inside them, though they could not have said what or why. She tore at her eyes with her fingers, not enough to blind herself, but enough to draw blood, enough to mark her face with the visible signs of anguish. She clawed at her mouth until her lips bled. She struck her thighs with such force that bruises bloomed like dark flowers across her skin. These were not merely gestures of grief. They were magical acts, each one a prayer written in the language of the body, each wound a petition to the cosmos itself. She dressed herself in a single garment, rough and unadorned, like a beggar in the streets. Ninshuba, who normally moved through the world with the dignity befitting the Sukkal of the Queen of Heaven, now made herself small, diminished, abject. It was theatre, yes, but it was also truth. Without Inanna, what was she? Just another voice crying out in a universe that seemed increasingly indifferent to suffering. And then, when the rituals of visible grief had been completed, when her body bore the marks of her devotion and her voice had grown hoarse from wailing, Ninshuba began the second part of her task, petitioning the great gods. She went first to Enlil, father of all things, lord of the air, keeper of cosmic law. His temple stood at the center of Nippur, a monument to order and authority. The architecture itself seemed designed to remind mortals and lesser gods alike of their place in the hierarchy of being. Everything about it spoke of permanence, of rules that could not be bent, of laws that preceded even the gods themselves. Ninshuba entered with her garment torn, her face bloodied, her voice breaking with grief. She prostrated herself before the great god and spoke the words Inanna had taught her. "Father Enlil, do not let your daughter be put to death in the underworld. Do not let your bright silver be covered with the dust of the underworld. Do not let your precious lapis lazuli be broken into stone for the stoneworker. Do not let your fragrant boxwood be cut into wood for the woodworker. Do not let the young woman Inanna be put to death in the underworld." The petition was beautiful in its construction, each phrase building upon the last, each metaphor chosen to appeal to Enlil's sense of value and worth. Inanna was precious silver, valuable lapis lazuli, fragrant boxwood materials, too valuable to be reduced to their base components, resources too rare to be wasted. Enlil listened. His ancient eyes regarded Ninshuba with the kind of attention that made her feel both seen and utterly insignificant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of cosmic law behind every syllable. "Your mistress," he said slowly, "descended of her own will. She sought the underworld, though she belonged to the world above. She passed through the 7 gates, though she knew or should have known what would be required of her at each threshold. She challenged the authority of Ereshkigal in her own realm. She violated the sacred laws that separate the living from the dead." Tear. He paused, and in that pause, Ninshuba felt her hope begin to crumble. "She has asked for bread and been given a corpse to eat," Enlil continued, his tone neither cruel nor kind, simply factual. "She has asked for water and been given dirty water to drink." The laws of the underworld are absolute. They are not subject to negotiation. They are not influenced by sentiment. What has happened to Inanna is the inevitable consequence of her own actions. I will not intervene. The dismissal was absolute. Ninshuba rose from her prostration with tears streaming down her already bloodied face. She had known, on some level, that Enlil would refuse. He was the embodiment of order, after all, and order does not make exceptions for individual suffering, no matter how beloved the individual might be. But the protocol demanded that she ask, and so she had asked, and now she moved on to the next god on her list. She went to Nanna, god of the moon, keeper of the night's mysteries, protector of Inanna's divine bloodline. If Enlil represented cosmic law, Nanna represented something more personal: family obligation, the bonds of kinship that supposedly transcended even divine hierarchy. Surely, Ninshuba thought as she made her way to his temple, surely a god would not abandon his own daughter to rot in the realm of death. Nanna's temple was different from Enlil's. Where Enlil spoke of order and permanence, Nanna spoke of cycles and transformation. The moon waxes and wanes, dies and is reborn, disappears and returns. Surely the god who governed such cycles would understand the necessity of rescue, of transformation, of things returning from darkness into light. Ninshuba repeated her petition, her voice even more desperate now, her grief even more visible. "Father Nanna," she pleaded, "do not let your daughter be put to death in the underworld. Do not let your bright silver be covered with the dust of the underworld. Do not let your precious lapis lazuli be broken into stone for the stoneworker. Do not let your fragrant boxwood be cut into wood for the woodworker. Do not let the young woman Inanna be put to death in the underworld." Nanna listened. His silver eyes, eyes that had witnessed countless nights, countless cycles of death and rebirth, regarded Ninshuba with something that might have been sympathy. But when he spoke, his words echoed Enlil's with devastating precision. "My daughter descended of her own will," he said, and there was sadness in his voice, but also resignation. "She challenged the laws of the underworld. She has received the judgment appropriate to her transgression. The boundaries between life and death exist for a reason. They cannot be violated without consequence. I will not intervene." Ninshuba felt something break inside her then. Not hope, not yet, but the naive belief that divine kinship meant anything in the face of cosmic law. Nanna, who had fathered Inanna, who had watched her rise to power and glory, who had presumably loved her in whatever way gods love their children, even he would not challenge the authority of the underworld to save her. Two gods had refused. Two gods had cited the inviolability of death's laws and turned her away. And Ninshuba, standing in Nanna's temple with her bloodied face and her torn garment and her breaking heart, had to face the possibility that the third god would refuse as well. That Inanna would remain dead, that the Queen of Heaven would hang on that hook for all eternity, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when even the mighty overstep their boundaries. But she had made a promise, and Ninshuba, if nothing else, kept her promises. She went to Eridu, to the temple of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh waters, keeper of secrets, protector of life. Enki's temple was unlike either Enlil's or Nanna's. Where theirs spoke of order and cycles, Enki's spoke of abundance and possibility. Water flowed through channels in the very architecture, a reminder that Enki governed the Absu, the sweet water that lay beneath the earth and made life possible. His domain was not order or transformation, but creation itself, the fundamental force that brings new things into being, that finds solutions where none seem to exist, that operates according to rules that are more fluid than cosmic law. Ninshuba entered, and immediately she felt different here. Not hopeful, exactly, but less crushed by inevitability. There was something in the atmosphere of Enki's temple that suggested that even the seemingly impossible might be negotiated, might be reimagined, might be approached from an angle that rendered it suddenly solvable. She prostrated herself before the god and spoke her petition one final time, her voice now barely above a whisper from all the wailing and pleading. "Father Enki, do not let your daughter be put to death in the underworld. Do not let your bright silver be covered with the dust of the underworld. Do not let your precious lapis lazuli be broken into stone for the stoneworker. Do not let your fragrant boxwood be cut into wood for the woodworker. Do not let the young woman Inanna be put to death in the underworld." Enki listened, and here finally something shifted. Where Enlil and Nanna had responded with resignation and refusal, Enki responded with something else entirely: grief. Not the performative grief that Ninshuba had enacted in the ruins. Not the political grief of a god concerned about losing a valuable asset, but genuine personal grief, the kind that comes from understanding, on a fundamental level, what has been lost. "Inanna," he said softly, and there was pain in the way he spoke her name. "My daughter, my bright star, she has been killed." It was the first acknowledgement Ninshuba had received from any of the great gods that what had happened was not merely justice applied, but also tragedy experienced. The first recognition that even when cosmic law is satisfied, something of value can still be lost. Enki rose from his throne, his mind already working through the problem. And this, perhaps, was what distinguished him from the other gods. Where they saw only law and consequence, Enki saw a puzzle to be solved, a challenge to be met with creativity rather than resignation. "The laws of the underworld are indeed absolute," he said, pacing now, his fingers moving as if already fashioning the solution from empty air. "Enlil and Nanna are correct in that regard. But perhaps," he paused, his eyes distant, calculating, "perhaps there is a way to work within those laws rather than against them." Tu Ninshuba, still prostrate, felt something like hope beginning to flicker in her chest. Enki stopped pacing and looked down at his hands, those divine hands that had shaped humanity from clay, that had given mortals the knowledge they needed to survive, that created solutions where none had existed before. He brought his hands together, and with deliberate care, he reached beneath one fingernail and extracted a tiny piece of dirt. It was nothing really, the smallest possible amount of matter, dust and grime accumulated from the work of creation. Most beings would have brushed it away without a second thought, but in Enki's hands, nothing was ever merely nothing. He placed the dirt in his palm and breathed upon it, spoke to it, shaped it with his will. And before Ninshuba's astonished eyes, the dirt began to form itself into a figure, small, no larger than a human hand, but complete, coherent, alive. "The Kogara," Enki said, naming the creature even as it took its final form. It was difficult to describe what the Kogara was. Not male, certainly, but not female either. Not human, but not entirely divine. It existed in a category that had no name, that defied the rigid classifications by which both the world above and the world below organized reality. And this, Enki understood, was exactly what made it perfect for the task ahead. 2. He reached beneath another fingernail and extracted more dirt. Again he shaped it with breath and will and creative intention. A second figure formed, similar to the first but distinct, the Galatua. "Neither male nor female," Enki murmured, examining his creations with satisfaction. "Neither alive in the way the gods understand life, nor dead in the way the underworld defines death. Neither entirely flesh nor entirely spirit. You exist, my small ones, in the spaces between categories. And that is precisely what will allow you to navigate the underworld's laws." The Kurgara and Galatur looked up at their creator with eyes that held more understanding than their tiny forms should have been capable of containing. Enki then retrieved 2 items from his stores, the food of life and the water of life. These were not metaphorical concepts, but actual substances, tangible things that held within them the power to reverse death itself. He gave the food of life to the Kurgara and the water of life to the Galatur, instructing them to guard these precious gifts carefully. "Now, listen," Enki said, crouching down so he could address his creations at eye level, "for what I am about to tell you is crucial. The underworld cannot be stormed. It cannot be conquered. The laws that govern it are absolute, and any attempt to simply seize Inanna's corpse and flee will result in your own destruction and her permanent death." The small creatures nodded, absorbing every word. But there is something about Ereshkigal that Enlil and Nanna have forgotten, perhaps because they have not bothered to truly see her in millennia, Enki continued, and now his voice held something like tenderness. "She is not simply the queen of the dead, not simply the enforcer of cosmic law. She is also a being in profound suffering. She sits on that throne in that silent palace, ruling over the dead, with no one to speak to, no one to understand her, no one to acknowledge the weight of what she endures." He paused, letting this understanding settle into the small beings before him. "When you enter the underworld, and you will be able to enter precisely because you do not fit the categories by which it judges visitors, you will find Ereshkigal in pain. Physical pain, emotional pain, existential pain. The kind of pain that comes from eternal isolation and the burden of absolute authority over death itself. And here is what you must do. You must witness that pain. You must acknowledge it. You must offer her something that no one has offered her in all the ages of her rule." What is that, Creator?" the Kurgara asked in a voice like wind through reeds. "Empathy," Enki said simply. "When she moans, 'Oh, my heart,' you must respond, 'You are troubled, Our Lady, oh, your heart.' When she cries, 'Oh, my liver,' you must echo, 'You are troubled, Our Lady, oh, your liver.' Mirror her pain, acknowledge her suffering. Give her the gift of being truly seen, truly heard, truly understood." The Galatur tilted its small head. "And this will make her release Inanna?" "Not directly," Enki admitted. "But it will create a space for gratitude, for obligation, for the kind of debt that even the Queen of the Underworld must acknowledge. When she asks what you want as payment for this gift of empathy, you must request the corpse that hangs on the hook on the wall. She will object, of course, but you will insist. And because you have given her something precious, because you have offered her genuine recognition of her suffering, she will grant your request." He held up the food and water of life. "Once you have the corpse, sprinkle this food and water upon it. 60 times the food, 60 times the water. And Inanna will rise. Not as she was, that restoration will take time, but alive, returned from death, rescued from the absolute finality that even gods fear." Afar, the Kurgara and Galatur accepted their instructions with solemn nods. They understood the gravity of their mission, the precision required, the stakes involved. "One more thing," Enki said, and now his voice carried a warning. "The underworld will demand a substitute. That is one law even I cannot circumvent. When Inanna rises, when she returns to the world above, the underworld will send its demons, the Gala, to accompany her. They will search for someone to take her place. This cannot be avoided. It is the price of her return. But that," he said with a glance at Ninshubur, "is a problem for after the rescue is complete." Ninshubur, who had been listening to all of this with growing amazement, finally found her voice. "Will this work?" she asked, and the question held everything, all her hope, all her fear, all her desperate love for her mistress. Enki regarded her with those ancient, knowing eyes. "It should work," he said. "The plan is sound. The creatures are perfectly suited to the task. The gifts are genuine. But there is always risk, always uncertainty. The underworld is not like the realm above. It does not respond to force or authority or divine mandate. It responds only to its own laws and, perhaps, to genuine human or divine connection." He turned back to the Kagara and Galatur. "Go now," he commanded. "Travel to the underworld. Do as I have instructed, and bring the Queen of Heaven back to the world of the living." The two small creatures bowed to their creator, clutched their precious gifts, and began their descent. They moved like shadows, like whispers, like things that barely exist and are therefore able to slip through cracks that would stop more substantial beings. They passed through the gates of the underworld without challenge because they did not register as living things requiring judgment, nor as dead things requiring processing. They simply were, undefined and therefore unconstrained by the categories that bound everyone else. Ninshubur watched them go, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that, perhaps, just perhaps, her beloved queen might return after all. Enki returned to his throne, his expression contemplative. "Go home, faithful Ninshubur," he said gently. "Wait. Hope. The outcome is not certain, but the attempt has been made. And sometimes, that is all even gods can do. Make the attempt, and trust that wisdom and compassion might accomplish what force and authority cannot." The descent of the Kagara and Galatur into the underworld was unlike any journey that had been made before or would be made again. They moved through space as if space itself held no particular meaning for them, as if the distinction between the world above and the world below was simply a matter of perspective rather than an absolute boundary. Like flies, the ancient texts say, slipping through cracks in the gates. And this image, simple as it seems, contains profound truth. A fly does not negotiate with a gate. A fly does not announce itself or request entry. A fly simply exists in a category so fundamentally different from those who guard gates that the guards do not even perceive it as something requiring attention. The Kagara carried the food of life clasped carefully against its small chest. The Galatur held the water of life in vessels that seemed almost too fragile for the journey, yet held firm. Neither creature spoke as they descended through the layers of earth, through the passages that grew progressively darker and colder. They did not need to speak. Their understanding of their purpose was complete and absolute. When they reached the palace of Ganza, when they passed through the 7 gates without challenge, because they were neither alive in the way the gates understood life, nor dead in the way the gates understood death, they found themselves in the throne room. The lapis lazuli walls glowed with that cold, blue-green luminescence. The dust hung in the air like a permanent fog. And there, in the centre of that vast, terrible space, sat Ereshkigal, Dom Ball. But she was not sitting in the way a queen sits. She was writhing. Her form was contorted, her body twisted as if in the grip of forces beyond her control. No linen covered her. Her breasts were exposed, heaving with effort. Her hair swirled around her head like leeks torn from the earth, and from her throat came sounds that were almost not words. Moans, cries, the keening of someone in profound and unbearable pain. "Oh, oh, my inside!" she cried out, and the words echoed through the throne room with a desperation that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere physical agony. This was not the pain of illness or injury. This was existential pain. This was the pain of bearing the weight of all death, of carrying the burden of infinite isolation, of enduring an eternity of silence and sorrow with no prospect of reprieve. The Kurgara and Galatur stood at the entrance to the throne room and, in that moment, they made a choice that no one else had made before them. They did not attempt to approach Ereshkigal directly. They did not try to negotiate or demand or strike any kind of bargain. Instead, they simply began to moan along with her. "Oh, oh, oh, you're inside," they cried, matching the pitch and intensity of her keening, echoing her agony back to her. Ereshkigal stopped. The endless moaning ceased abruptly, as if she had suddenly forgotten how to make sound. She looked toward the source of the voices, and in that look was an expression that had never crossed her face in all the eons of her rule. Confusion, yes, but also something else. Something that might have been hope, or perhaps it was simply surprise at the existence of another consciousness that had acknowledged her suffering. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from wailing, the words coming slowly, as if she was not certain how to form them anymore. "Who moans with me? Who sighs with me? If you are gods, I will bless you. If you are mortals, I will give you a gift." The Kurgara and Galatur did not answer with words. Instead, they moved closer to the Queen of the Underworld, and in their movements was an entire philosophy of compassion. They did not approach her as subjects approaching a ruler, or as visitors approaching a host. They approached her as fellow sufferers, recognizing each other across the void of pain. They sat near her, and as she continued to moan and cry out, "Oh, oh, my liver!" they echoed her cries, "Oh, oh, your liver!" When she wailed, "Oh, oh, my heart!" they responded, "Oh, oh, your heart!" This was not mocking. This was not parody or mockery or any kind of disrespect. This was the highest form of validation that one being could offer to another, the act of truly hearing, truly seeing, truly acknowledging the reality of their suffering. In a realm where no one had seen Ereshkigal in millennia, where she sat alone on her throne surrounded by the dead and the indifferent and the unchanging, here were these small, undefined creatures who were witnessing her pain, not dismissing it, not trying to minimize it or fix it or make it stop, but simply being present with it. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the throne room. It was subtle, not a dramatic transformation, but a gradual softening, a slight warming of the cold, deadly air. Ereshkigal's cries began to transform from pure agony into something more like release. She was still in pain, that it was being held now. It was being witnessed. And there is something about pain that is witnessed that makes it bearable in ways that isolated pain never can be. After a time, and time itself seemed to move differently in this exchange, Ereshkigal's breathing began to stabilize. Her writhing slowed. She looked at the two small creatures with eyes that had transformed from the empty stare of a god in torment into something more present, more aware. "You," she said slowly, "sat with me. You heard me. You acknowledged my suffering when no one else has done so in all the ages of my reign. This is a gift beyond measure. I have been alone for so long. I have borne this burden for so long, and you, undefined creatures from a realm I cannot fully comprehend, you recognized my pain as real and worthy of attention." She rose from her throne, and in that movement was a new kind of authority, not the crushing weight of cosmic law, but something more genuine. She approached the Kurgara and Galatur, and when she spoke again, her voice was steady, almost gentle by comparison to the harsh tones that had characterized her before. "You have given me something I did not know it was possible to receive. You have given me witness. You have given me recognition. For this act of compassion, I wish to give you a gift in return. Ask me what you will. I will grant it if it is in my power to grant it." The Kurgara and Galatur exchanged a glance, though no words passed between them. They already knew what they would request. Enki had instructed them, but more than that, they understood the purpose of this moment. a gift given and received, an obligation created, a debt that even the queen of the underworld could not ignore. Noite, we ask, the Galatur said, its voice soft but clear, for the corpse that hangs upon the hook on the wall. The body of the goddess Inanna, who descended into your realm and was struck down by your judgment. We ask for her. Ereshkigal's expression hardened, but not with anger, with resistance, with something like regret. That I cannot grant, she said, and the finality in her voice was absolute. She transgressed. She violated the laws of the underworld. The sentence has been passed. She hangs there as a reminder that even gods are subject to the laws of death. To give you her corpse would be to undermine the very foundation of my authority. But the Kurgara and Galatur did not retreat. They had expected this response. They had been prepared for it by Enki, who understood that Ereshkigal was bound by more than mere whim. She was bound by law, by duty, by the cosmic order that she herself had helped to create. We have witnessed your suffering, the Kurgara said, and in its voice was the gentleness that comes from genuine compassion. We have sat with you in your pain. We have acknowledged your torment when no other being in all of creation has done so in ages beyond counting. We ask not to challenge your authority, but to honor the gift you have offered us. We ask because we have given you something precious, and a gift given must be honored with a gift received. This is not about defying law, it is about acknowledging obligation. There was a long silence. Ereshkigal stood before the small creatures, and in her face was a conflict that perhaps no god had experienced before, the conflict between cosmic law and genuine divine connection. Between the absolute and the particular, between the rules that govern the universe and the bonds that connect individual beings to one another. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost defeated. You will take her corpse, but know this, the laws of the underworld are not subject to exception. For every being that leaves this realm, a substitute must take their place. This is not something I can waive. This is not something even the highest God can change. It is the price of return. It is the cost of resurrection. The Kurgara and Galatur nodded. They had expected this as well. Enki had warned them. The law of exchange was fundamental to the cosmic order. Nothing came without a price. Nothing could be taken without something else being given in return. The underworld did not work on charity, it worked on balance. Ereshkigal reached up to the wall where Inanna's corpse hung. The body had been hanging there for 3 days, and the process of decay had begun its slow work. The divine flesh was beginning to darken, to lose its luminescence, to transform into something else. Soon it would be indistinguishable from any other corpse in the underworld. The Queen of Heaven would become simply another piece of the realm's endless supply of the dead. With careful hands, Ereshkigal removed the body from the hook. It was surprisingly light. All the divine essence had drained from it, leaving only the hollow shell of flesh and bone. She placed it gently in the arms of the Kurgara and Galatur, and in that gesture was perhaps the first kindness she had shown to another being in ages beyond counting. You know what must be done, Ereshkigal said. You carry with you the food of life and the water of life. Use them, restore her. But remember, she cannot leave without someone to take her place. The balance must be maintained. The laws must be satisfied. The Galatur withdrew the food of life sustenance drawn from the deepest sources of creation, from the forces that perpetually renew and restore. The Kurgara held the water of life, liquid essence of continuity, of flow, of the unbroken stream that connects all living things. They laid Inanna's corpse gently on the ground of the throne room, and then, with ritualistic precision, they began the restoration. 60 times they sprinkled the food of life upon her body. 60 times they poured the water of life across her form. The number 60 was not arbitrary. It was the number of completion in Mesopotamian mathematics, the number that represented the full cycle of transformation. With each application, change began to manifest in the corpse. The darkening flesh began to lighten. The stiffness began to soften. The emptiness began to fill with presence. It was not instantaneous. It was not the dramatic resurrection of myth and legend. It was slow, gradual, the patient work of restoration. But it was real. Awe. And then, in a moment that was neither beginning nor ending but simply the crossing of a threshold, Inanna breathed. Her lungs filled with air, the thick, stale air of the underworld, but air nonetheless. Her eyes opened, her body moved, she was no longer dead. She was transformed by death, yes, stripped of her divine regalia and her cosmic authority, reduced and diminished but alive, returned to the realm of the living. She lay on the ground of the throne room, gasping, her mind struggling to process what had happened. She remembered the gates. She remembered being stripped of each symbol of power. She remembered the throne room and the Anunnaki. She remembered the Eye of Death. She remembered Ereshkigal's voice pronouncing judgment. And then there was nothing. And now there was this return, this restoration, this impossible rescue from absolute finality. "Rise," the Kugara said gently, extending a small hand to help her up. "We must ascend. The underworld will not hold you now that you are restored. But you must move quickly. The balance has been disturbed, and it will seek to re-establish itself." Inanna rose unsteadily to her feet. She was still naked, still stripped of all the symbols of power that had once defined her. But she was alive. That was the only thing that mattered in this moment. The three of them, the goddess and the two undefined creatures who had achieved what even the greatest gods could not, began to ascend from the throne room. They passed back through the passages of the palace, climbed toward the 7 gates that Inanna had descended through mere days before. But as they rose, as they moved toward the light of the world above, something else began to manifest. The Gala, the demons of the underworld, the enforcers of cosmic law, the ones who ensured that the balance was maintained and that every debt was paid. They emerged from the dust and shadow-like forms taking shape out of fog. There were 7 of them, and they moved with the inexorable purpose of beings who had one job and were utterly committed to performing it. They were not cruel, not in any personal sense. They were not evil or malicious. They were simply the mechanism by which the underworld ensured that no one escaped without payment. "Misstop," the leader of the Gala commanded, his voice like stones grinding together. "The Queen of Heaven may not leave without providing a substitute. This is law. This is absolute. For every being that escapes from death, another must take their place. Who will you send to the underworld? Who will hang where you hung? Who will remain in our realm while you return to the world above?" Inanna felt the weight of that question settle upon her like a physical force. She had been so focused on simply surviving, on being restored to life, that she had not considered this final cost. The balance, the exchange, the fundamental truth that nothing in creation is free. Every gift must be paid for with something of equal value. The Kugara and Galatur stepped back, their role in this story drawing to its conclusion. They had delivered their message. They had restored the goddess. Now Inanna herself would have to make the choice that would determine the final shape of this myth, the final transformation that would echo through all the ages to come. She rose from the stone floor of the underworld, still naked, still diminished, but no longer dead. The Gala surrounded her, waiting. The demons of death waited for her response. In the world above, Ninshuba continued to wait as well, though she did not yet know that her beloved queen had been restored. Ereshkigal watched from her throne as Inanna reached the passage that led upward toward the light. And in the queen of the underworld's expression was something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been sorrow, or might have been the complex mixture of both that characterized all things in that realm. The Gala followed close behind Inanna, their presence a reminder that the price of resurrection is that someone, somewhere, must pay. That is the law. That has always been the law. And even gods are not exempt from it. The ascent toward the world above began, but it was an ascent that would not end in simple triumph. It was an ascent that would lead to a reckoning. It was an ascent that would force Inanna to make a choice that would define her descent as more than just a myth about resurrection, but as a story about sacrifice, about the complexity of rescue, and about the terrible truth that freedom always costs someone. And as she climbed, with the Gala at her heels, demanding a name, demanding a substitute, Inanna had to confront the central paradox of her entire journey. She had been saved, but the saving was incomplete. For her to live, someone else would have to die. For her to return to the throne, another would have to take her place. The wheel of death and life turns, and none can escape its turning. And now, Inanna would discover, the real test of her descent was not the gates or the judgment or even the death itself. The real test was what she would do now that she had been given back her life, and the Gala awaited her answer. The ascent from the underworld began in silence, and that silence was perhaps the most terrifying thing Inanna had yet experienced. The Gala surrounded her as she climbed, 7 demons, inexorable and patient, their presence a constant reminder that her resurrection had come with a price that had not yet been paid. She moved through passages that grew progressively lighter, through layers of earth that became progressively warmer, and with each step upward she felt the cold grip of the underworld loosening its hold on her. The grip of the Gala did not loosen. They remained at her side, and with every emergence toward the light, their attention grew more focused, more acute. They were searching. They were hunting. They were waiting for Inanna to lead them to a suitable replacement, a life that would balance the ledger, a soul that would take her place in the darkness and silence below. "Who?" Faye demanded as she climbed, their voices echoing up through the passages. "Who will you give us? Who will remain when you return to the light? The law is absolute. The balance must be maintained. You cannot leave without providing a substitute." Inanna did not answer. She could not answer, not yet. Not while she was still in the grip of the underworld itself, still touched by its dust and its cold and its absolute finality. She needed to return to the world above. She needed to see sunlight. She needed to breathe air that was not thick with the accumulated decay of ages. So she climbed, silent and naked and transformed, with the Gala at her heels and a terrible choice waiting for her somewhere ahead. When she finally emerged into the world of light, the change was almost violent in its intensity. The sun, that celestial body she had taken for granted for all of her existence, struck her like a physical force. She had forgotten, in merely 3 days, what daylight felt like. She had forgotten what it meant to feel warmth on her skin. She had forgotten the color of green things, the sound of bird song, the smell of earth and growth, and the perpetual process of renewal that characterized all life above ground. She fell to her knees in the dust of the surface world, and for a moment she simply breathed, deep, shaking breaths that seemed to draw life itself back into her form. The Gala stood around her in a semicircle, waiting with that infuriating patience that characterizes beings who have all of eternity to accomplish their tasks. Time Inanna said finally, her voice hoarse and strange to her own ears. "I need time to think, to understand, to decide who will take my place." "We do not grant time," the leader of the gala replied, and there was something almost sympathetic in his tone. "But we will wait while you visit your temples and your cities. We will follow you as you see what has become of your domain in your absence. And when we reach the moment of reckoning, you will tell us who will come with us to the underworld." And so began the strangest of all the strange elements of this already unimaginable journey. Inanna, naked and stripped of all her power, walked through the world above with 7 demons at her side. To those who did not know what had occurred, it might have appeared as if she was being led by them, as if she were their prisoner rather than their charge. But those who could perceive deeper realities understood what was happening. They understood that the Queen of Heaven was being escorted by the forces of death itself, and that this escort was not hostile, but rather ceremonial, a procession of judgment moving through the realm of the living. She went first to the city of Bad Tabira, where great temples stood, and her priestesses moved through elaborate rituals of mourning. When the priestesses saw her, naked, diminished, but unmistakably alive, they let out cries of joy and relief that echoed through the temple courtyards. They rushed to embrace her, to clothe her, to offer her comfort and sustenance. The gala watched from a distance, neither interfering nor departing, simply waiting. But the joy of the priestesses was complicated by the presence of the 7 demons. They understood, as Inanna herself understood, that her return came with a price. They understood that someone would have to be paid as the cost of her resurrection, and so their joy was tinged with dread, each priestess secretly wondering whether she might be the one chosen. Inanna moved through the temples and the cities with increasing dread in her heart. Each place she visited, she found her people mourning. The mourning had been elaborate and genuine. Ninshubur had done her work well, and the grief of Inanna's servants had translated into the visible signs of despair throughout her domain. The temples were draped in dark cloth. The priestesses had torn their garments and marked themselves with ash. In the marketplaces, merchants had suspended their transactions. In the homes, people had gathered to share stories of the Queen of Heaven and the loss they had experienced in her absence. It was beautiful and terrible. It was the kind of mourning that should have filled Inanna with satisfaction, proof of how beloved she was, how deeply her absence had been felt, how significant her existence was to all those who worshipped her. But instead, it filled her with something more complex. It filled her with sadness, with a new understanding of what sacrifice meant, with the dawning realization that her existence was not simply about her own glory and power, but was interwoven with the lives and fates of countless others. The gala followed her through all of this, silent observers of her kingdom's grief. And then she came to Uruk, the greatest of all her cities, the place where her most magnificent temple stood. The city where she had been born and had lived as a girl, where she had learned the arts of love and war, where she had accumulated much of the power that had defined her throughout her existence. When she entered Uruk, she expected to find the same mourning she had encountered in the other cities. She expected to find her temple draped in black cloth, her altar covered in ash, her people wailing in the streets. She expected to find her husband, Dumuzid, there in some attitude of proper lamentation, perhaps fasting, perhaps tearing at his own clothing, perhaps engaged in some ritual of grief that would honor the memory of his wife. Kaba, but what she found instead stopped her in her tracks. In her temple, in the great hall where she should have been mourned, there was music. Not funeral music, not the slow, mournful dirges that should have echoed through those sacred spaces, but celebration music. Lively, joyful, the kind of music that accompanied feasts and festivals. And on her throne, the throne that had been carved specifically for her, that had been consecrated with her sacred energy, that represented her authority over Uruk, sat Dumuzid. He was not mourning, he was not fasting, he was not engaged in any ritual of grief whatsoever. Instead, he wore fine robes of crimson and gold, the kind of garments that represented joy and celebration. His fingers were adorned with rings. His neck bore ornaments of precious stone, and around him, in the temple of the Queen of Heaven, were gathered musicians and dancers and revelers, those who had apparently decided that the death of Inanna was not a tragedy but an opportunity for celebration. Dumuzid was eating. Dumuzid was drinking. Dumuzid was, in point of fact, sitting on the throne of the Queen of Heaven and entirely unaware that said queen had just entered her own temple. Something happened in Inanna's chest in that moment. It was not anger, not in the simple sense of anger. It was something far more complex and far more terrible. It was betrayal recognized in its purest form. It was the collapse of assumptions about who Dumuzid was and what he meant to her and what she meant to him. Dumuzid had been her husband. The texts were clear on this. He was described as the man of my heart, as someone she had chosen, had loved, had given her favor to over and over again. There were love songs composed about the two of them, verses that spoke of their union as something sacred and profound. And yet here he sat, not mourning her death but celebrating it, not honoring her memory but disgracing it, not sitting in her temple in an attitude of humble sorrow but occupying her throne in an attitude of triumph. She walked toward him slowly, and, as she did, the sounds of celebration gradually died away. Those gathered in the temple began to notice her presence. They began to see the Queen of Heaven, naked, stripped of all adornment, covered in the dust of the underworld, but unmistakably alive and moving toward them with a purpose that was written plainly in every step she took. Dumuzid was the last to notice her. He was in mid-sip of wine, his hand raised to his lips, when he suddenly became aware of a change in the atmosphere of the room. He lowered his cup and turned his head slowly, and when his eyes met Inanna's, he froze. W4. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space of the temple. The wife who had been dead and was now alive, and the husband who had failed to mourn her, who had instead taken her place on her throne and claimed the privileges of her position. "Iai Inanna," Dumuzid said, and his voice was uncertain, as if he was not entirely certain whether she was real or some vision sent to haunt him. "You have returned." "I have returned," Inanna confirmed, and her voice now carried a quality that it had never held before. Not the charming, seductive quality that had made lovers fall at her feet, and not the commanding, authoritative quality that made warriors obey her without hesitation. It carried something else entirely. It carried judgment. She came to stand before him, and Dumuzid rose from her throne. At least he had that much courtesy. But he did not vacate it entirely. He stood beside it, as if not quite ready to relinquish the position, as if the 3 days he had spent sitting in that seat had given him some claim to ownership over it. "Twait, I died," Inanna said, and each word was precise, deliberate, landing with the weight of stones. "I descended into the underworld. I passed through 7 gates. I was stripped of everything that made me who I was. I was killed by my sister. I hung as a corpse on a hook on a wall in the realm of death for 3 days. Dumuzid said nothing. His face had gone pale beneath the finery of his celebratory clothing. "And while I was dead," Inanna continued, and now her voice took on a quality that was even more terrible because it was not loud or harsh, but was instead controlled, precise, utterly devoid of mercy. "While I was being judged and found wanting and executed by the laws of the underworld, you sat on my throne. You wore fine robes. You celebrated. You did not mourn. You did not weep. You did not tear at your clothing or ash your face, or perform any of the rituals that a husband should perform when his wife has entered the realm of death." I didn't know," Dumuzid began, but Inanna raised her hand and silence fell over him like a physical thing. "You didn't know," she said, and there was something in her tone now that suggested she was finding his excuse not just inadequate, but almost offensive. "Ninshuba knew." Ninshuba wailed in the streets and beat the drums and tore at her own flesh until blood ran down her cheeks. "Ninshuba went to the great gods and begged for my rescue." Ninshuba was faithful unto the point of self-destruction, faithful to a god who had given her instructions and a task, faithful because that is what loyalty means. She paused, and in that pause was the weight of everything she had learned in the underworld, everything about power and its absence, everything about the cost of others' devotion, everything about the difference between genuine connection and the hollow performance of it. "But you," Inanna said softly, "did not know, or worse, you did not care." She took a step closer to Dumuzid, and in that moment something shifted in the atmosphere of the temple. The musicians stopped playing entirely. The dancers froze mid-motion. The revelers held their cups suspended in the air. They all seemed to understand that something of cosmic significance was about to occur. "But the gala," Inanna said, and she pointed her finger directly at her husband, "will take him." The 7 demons, who had been standing silently at the edges of the temple, moved forward as one. Dumuzid's eyes widened in recognition. He understood immediately what was being offered. He understood that his wife, returned from death, was offering him as the price of her resurrection. He understood that he was about to be taken to the underworld to replace her in whatever punishment or imprisonment had been prepared there. He ran. This was perhaps the most pathetic moment of Dumuzid's existence. Here was a god, a shepherd, a fertility deity, a king, a consort of the Queen of Heaven, and in the moment of his judgment, his only response was to run like a mortal fleeing from capture. He bolted from the throne room of the temple, and the gala pursued him with the inexorable purpose of beings who have been given their task and will not cease until that task is complete. What followed was a chase that would become legendary, a pursuit that moved through the streets of Uruk and beyond, a desperate flight from a fate that was both inevitable and deserved. Through the marketplaces he ran, and those who had been celebrating his presence saw him fleeing and understood immediately that their festive participation in Inanna's temple had been complicit in a crime of cosmic proportions. They had witnessed a husband who did not mourn his wife's death. They had participated in a celebration that was, in retrospect, a mockery of the divine order itself. The gala followed, and their movements were terrible in their certainty. They did not rush with frantic energy. They did not lunge or strike or attempt to simply overpower their prey through brute force. Instead, they moved with the patient, inexorable quality of death itself. They followed Dumuzid as surely as a shadow follows a body in sunlight, inevitable, inescapable, as real as the laws of physics. He fled from the city, out into the countryside, seeking shelter in places where the gala could not follow. But the gala were not bound by the normal constraints of geography or environment. They followed him across fields and through forests, across rivers and over mountains. Everywhere he went, there they were. And all the while, Inanna watched from her temple. She did not pursue him herself. She did not need to. She had set the gala on him, and that was sufficient. The task would be accomplished. Dumuzid would be captured. The debt would be paid. The balance would be restored. But as she watched, something began to shift inside her. The anger that had driven her to make this judgment began to transform into something more complex. She remembered lying with Dumuzid, remembered the tenderness of those moments, remembered how he had wooed her, had made her feel valued and cherished in ways that were difficult for a goddess of her power and stature to experience. She remembered the love songs, she remembered the courtship, she remembered choosing him from among all the possibilities available to her. And she realized, in a moment of terrible clarity, that she did not actually want him to be consigned to the underworld forever. She did not want to lose him entirely. She had acted out of rage, out of betrayal, out of the wounded fury of someone who had been disrespected in the most profound way possible. But rage, she was learning, was not always a sufficient guide to action. Rage did not always lead to the best outcomes. Rage did not always result in justice. It sometimes resulted in tragedy. She began to move. She moved out of her temple and into the streets of Uruk. She moved with purpose, seeking to catch up with the Gala and the fleeing Dumuzid. And as she moved, she began to pray. She prayed to herself, to the forces of the universe, to whatever powers governed the realm of the dead and the realm of the living. She caught up to them in a sacred grove, a place where the boundaries between the world of gods and the world of mortals had always been particularly thin. Dumuzid had fled there seeking some final refuge, some sanctuary that might shield him from the inexorable pursuit of the Gala. But there was no sanctuary. There was only her, Inanna, the goddess he had failed to mourn, now standing before him with the Gala at her back. "Stop," she said to the demons, and they stopped. Their grip on Dumuzid loosened, though they did not release him entirely. "Swell." "There is another way," she said, and her voice carried an authority that came not from rage, but from something deeper, from wisdom perhaps, or from the hard-won understanding that comes from having faced death itself. She looked at Dumuzid, at the god she had loved and who had betrayed her, and she began to speak not in anger, but in contemplation. She spoke of what the underworld required. She spoke of what the laws of death demanded. She spoke of how the balance could be maintained without requiring Dumuzid to spend eternity in the realm of the dead. And then she spoke of compromise, of a path that would honor both justice and compassion, of a solution that had never been attempted before but that might, if the powers of the cosmos would allow it, reshape the very nature of death and renewal. Now, Dumuzid will spend half the year in the underworld, she declared, and her voice echoed through the sacred grove as if the forces of the universe themselves were listening. For half the year he will dwell in the realm of death, in the palace of Ereshkigal, in the dust and silence of the world below. This will be his penance for his failure to mourn me. This will be his acknowledgement of my power and the cost of his disrespect. The Gala murmured among themselves, uncertain whether this constituted an acceptable resolution. But for the other half of the year, Inanna continued, he will return to the world above. He will be with me. He will share my throne. He will experience the green growing things, and the sunlight and the abundance of the world of the living. And the cycle will continue, season after season, age after age, so that all beings will understand that life and death are not opposites, but partners in a dance that never ends. She turned to where Dumuzid's sister Inanna stood, watching from the edges of the grove, having followed her brother in his flight. Inanna was a goddess in her own right, associated with agriculture and the fertility of the earth. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, the importance of cycles and seasons, of growth and decay, of the perpetual transformation that governed all of nature. Inanna, Inanna said, will take Dumuzid's place when he is below. For half the year she will dwell in the underworld. For the other half she will return to the world above. Sister and brother will share the burden. The cycle will be complete. Inanna stepped forward and nodded solemnly. She understood what was being asked of her. She understood that this was not a punishment but a sacred responsibility. She understood that her willingness to take this role was essential to maintaining the balance between the world above and the world below. The Gala looked at one another, and some kind of silent communication passed between them. The communication of beings who serve law rather than passion, who understand that compromise can sometimes satisfy the demands of justice as effectively as punishment can. "This is acceptable," their leader said finally. "This satisfies the requirement for balance. This honors the laws of the underworld while also acknowledging the possibility of mercy and transformation." Pact of compromise was struck. The first compromise ever made between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The first time that the absolute finality of death had been negotiated with, had been adjusted, had been made subject to cycles and seasons and the perpetual motion of transformation. Dumuzid was released by the Gala, though he remained bound to a fate that would repeat itself eternally, the cycle of descent and return, of death and rebirth, of spending half his year in the darkness below and half in the light above. And in this compromise, something fundamental shifted in the cosmos itself. The cycle of seasons that the ancients had observed, the pattern of growth and decay that governed agriculture and fertility, the rhythm of the year itself. All of this was now explained by this myth, this story, this truth that had been written into the very fabric of existence. In the hot months of summer, when the land grew dry and brown and seemingly lifeless, the Mesopotamians understood that it was because Dumuzid was in the underworld. The warmth and aridity were expressions of his absence, of the land mourning the death of the god of fertility and growth. In the spring and autumn, when rains came and vegetation flourished, the Mesopotamians understood that it was because Dumuzid had returned. The cycle was complete. Death and life were not enemies, but partners in an eternal dance. And Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, the goddess who had descended into the underworld and been stripped of all her power and her identity, who had died and been restored, who had faced the absolute finality of judgment and had survived. She had learned what perhaps no other god had ever truly understood. She had learned that power is not about domination. It is about understanding. It is about the willingness to sacrifice not just others for oneself, but oneself for others. It is about the recognition that every action has consequences that ripple out beyond the moment of action into the perpetual future. She had descended as an arrogant goddess convinced of her own dominion over all realms. She returned as a being fundamentally transformed by the journey, not humbled exactly, for Inanna never entirely lost her fierce dignity, but educated, changed, deepened by the experience of vulnerability, of powerlessness, of facing a reality that did not bend to her will. And so the descent of Inanna, which had begun with ambition and ended in death, became ultimately a story not about defeat, but about transformation. It became a myth that would echo through all the ages to come, a story that would be told and retold, a truth that would be repeated in rituals and ceremonies and the very cycles of nature itself. The Queen of Heaven had learned, and in learning she had taught all who came after her that there is no power greater than the willingness to die, not physically, necessarily, but psychologically, spiritually, in terms of one's attachment to status and domination. That there is no victory greater than the acknowledgement of vulnerability, and that there is no transformation greater than the one that comes from having faced the absolute and survived, changed, deepened, and made wise by the encounter. And so, dear dreamers, we come to the place where all stories eventually arrive. Not the ending, precisely, because stories like this one do not truly end. They circle. They return. They move in the eternal rhythm of descent and ascent, of death and rebirth, of the seasons turning and the wheel continuing its endless rotation. We have journeyed with Inanna from the moment of her arrogant decision to descend into the underworld, through the 7 gates where she was stripped of everything that made her who she was, through the terrible judgment of her sister and the Anunnaki, through her death and the desperation of those who loved her, through the rescue that came not from force but from compassion, and finally to the moment of her transformation, the moment where she learned that true power lies not in domination but in the willingness to sacrifice, not just others for oneself, but oneself for others. But perhaps the most important aspect of this myth, the element that has allowed it to echo across 4,000 years of human history, is that it does not end with Inanna's return to the world above. The story continues. The wheel turns, and in that continued turning we find something that speaks to the deepest truths of human existence. For what is the myth of Inanna's descent, fundamentally, but a story about what it means to be human? We are all like Inanna in our own way. We all begin our lives convinced of our own importance, our own power, our own ability to shape the world according to our will. We dress ourselves in the symbols of our accomplishments, our degrees, our titles, our possessions, our status. We move through the world believing that these things define us, that they make us who we are. And then, inevitably, life confronts us with our own limitations. We face moments where all our power means nothing. We encounter situations where we are stripped of our accomplishments, our status, our carefully constructed identities. We are reduced to our essential selves, vulnerable, naked, powerless. Some of us, perhaps many of us, resist these moments fiercely. We rail against them. We try to fight them. We attempt to use whatever power we have left to avoid the descent, to prevent the stripping away of everything we have built ourselves around. But Inanna teaches us something different. She teaches us that this descent, this stripping away, this reduction to our essential selves, this is not a punishment to be resisted. It is a transformation to be accepted. It is a trial to be survived, and it is an education that we cannot receive any other way. When Inanna hung as a corpse on the hook on the wall of the underworld, when she had been reduced to absolute nothing, when everything had been taken from her, that was when the real transformation could begin. Not before, not during her descent through the gates, but only when she had reached the absolute bottom, when she had nothing left to lose, was she ready to learn what she needed to learn. And what did she learn? Perhaps she learned that the boundary between herself and others is far more permeable than she had believed. She learned in the person of Ninshubur that genuine loyalty exists, that some beings will tear at their own flesh and move heaven and earth for those they love, not because they are compelled to do so, but because the love is real and complete. She learned, in the compassion of the Kugara and Galatur, that power exists in unexpected places, that these small, undefined creatures, beings who fit no category, who could not be classified or placed in the hierarchical structure of the cosmos, possessed a power that the great gods lacked. The power to recognize suffering, the power to sit with pain without trying to fix it or minimize it or make it go away, the power to offer witness. She learned, in the negotiation with her sister, that Ereshkigal's apparent cruelty was actually protection, that the queen of the underworld was not a villain, but a wounded being who had been bearing an unbearable burden for all the ages of existence. That what Ereshkigal needed was not to be conquered or challenged or overthrown, but to be recognized, to be understood, to be seen in her suffering. And finally, she learned, in the moment when she had to choose who would replace her in the underworld, that true power consists of the ability to feel regret, to make a judgment and then to reconsider that judgment, to choose mercy over vengeance, to offer compromise rather than demand absolute victory. These are not the lessons of the conqueror. These are the lessons of transformation. These are the lessons that only come through descent, through vulnerability, through the experience of powerlessness. And in learning these lessons, Inanna became something greater than she had been before, not a stronger queen, not a more powerful goddess, not a more successful ruler in the conventional sense, but something far more important. She became wise. The myth tells us that after her return, the cycles changed. The seasons began to follow a pattern that had not existed before. Dumuzid would descend into the underworld for 6 months of the year, and his sister Inanna would remain there for the other 6 months. When Dumuzid was below, the land grew dry and brown. Growth ceased, fertility diminished. It was as if the land itself was mourning. But when he returned, when the cycle moved into the season of his absence from the underworld, everything changed. Rain fell, seeds sprouted, the earth came alive again. And in this cycle, repeated year after year, age after age, the Mesopotamians saw the story of Inanna's descent encoded into the very fabric of nature. This is the genius of the myth. It does not remain confined to the realm of divine allegory or spiritual metaphor. It manifests itself in the physical world. It appears in the cycles of agriculture and fertility. It becomes visible in the turning of the seasons and the growth and decay of all living things. And so the lesson spreads beyond Inanna herself. Every seed that dies in the soil so that new plants can grow is participating in the myth. Every tree that sheds its leaves in autumn and stands bare against the winter sky is enacting the story. Every spring when the world comes alive again after the dormancy of winter is a recreation of Inanna's return. The myth teaches us that we are not separate from these cycles. We are embedded within them. We are not observers of death and rebirth, but participants in them. Every relationship we end is a descent into darkness and the possibility of resurrection. Every project we abandon is a death that might lead to new growth. Every loss we experience is an opportunity for transformation. And perhaps most importantly, the myth teaches us that descent is necessary, that we cannot become wise without experiencing vulnerability, that we cannot understand compassion without experiencing powerlessness, that we cannot learn to truly love without facing the reality that everything we love can be taken from us. This is why the story of Inanna has survived for 4,000 years. This is why it echoes through cultures and civilizations, modified and adapted, but fundamentally unchanged in its core message. Because it speaks to something true about existence itself, something that transcends any particular culture or time period or belief system. And it speaks to it in a way that intellectual understanding alone can never accomplish. The myth does not tell us that we should accept vulnerability and learn from powerlessness. It shows us a goddess, a being of immense power and importance, going through exactly that process. It allows us to witness her transformation, to feel the despair of her descent and the hope of her rescue, to understand on a level deeper than mere conceptual knowledge what it means to be stripped of everything and somehow survive. The story invites us, in other words, to see ourselves in Inanna, not because we are gods, but because we are capable of the same journey. We are capable of the same descent. We are capable of the same stripping away of illusions. We are capable of the same transformation. And in recognizing that capacity, in understanding that the journey through darkness is not a punishment but a possibility, we become capable of approaching our own descents, whatever form they might take, not with pure resistance but with a kind of acceptance, with a recognition that something important might be learned, that something precious might be gained, that we might emerge from the darkness transformed, deepened, and made wiser by the encounter. Bow. So the story continues, dear dreamers. It continues in every act of descent and return that you experience in your own lives. It continues in every moment when you are stripped of illusions about who you are and what matters. It continues in every encounter with your own powerlessness and your own capacity to survive that powerlessness. And perhaps when you find yourself in your own darkness, when you have been reduced to your essential self, when everything you thought defined you has been taken away, you might remember the story of Inanna. You might remember that she survived, that she was rescued, that she was transformed, that she returned changed but alive, and that her change ultimately benefited not just herself but all the world, all the people around her, all the cycles of nature that her transformation had reshaped. The descent is not the end of the story. It is always the beginning of something new, and in that truth lies the deepest comfort that the myth offers to all who hear it. Let us sit for a moment, then, in the knowledge of this story. Let us sit with the understanding that we are capable of descent, that we are capable of transformation, that we are capable of returning from the darkness changed and made wise. And as you drift towards sleep tonight, as you allow the weariness of the day to carry you down toward rest and dreams and the little deaths that sleep provides each night, remember that in that descent towards sleep, in that letting go of consciousness and control, you are enacting the myth. You are participating in the eternal cycle of descent and return. And tomorrow, when you wake, when you return to consciousness and the world of light and activity, you will be enacting the resurrection. You will be Inanna, ascending from the underworld, and in that daily cycle, in that nightly death and morning rebirth, you carry forward the ancient story. So may you descend with courage, may you find wisdom in your powerlessness, may you be rescued by those who love you, may you return transformed. And may you, like Inanna, use your transformation not for personal glory, but for the betterment of all those around you and all the cycles of nature with which you are so intimately connected. This has been the journey, dear dreamers, from arrogance to wisdom, from power to powerlessness to a new kind of power, from death to resurrection, from the Queen of Heaven descending to the darkness, to the transformed goddess rising to reshape the very cycles of the seasons. And now, as all stories do, this one comes to rest. But like the myth itself, it does not truly end. It circles, it returns. It waits for the next dreamer who needs to hear it, who needs to remember it, who needs to live it in their own way and in their own time. So may that dreamer be you, and may the story serve you well.